Chapter 7, An Unofficial Interview. Kudo shifted slowly, something poking his face very rudely. He shoved it away, groaning as he rubbed his eyes and sat up. God, he hated the kid. Sure, he at least had a warning this time. The kid had gotten better at realizing when he was going to switch them out, but he still hated the feeling of having a body again. Which one are you? Bakugou asked sharply, pushing Kudo off his chair. He hadn't fully gotten the tingling out of his body. Second, he said, flexing and unflexing his hands to try to get the feeling back in them. He needed to ground himself in order to speak to the person Seventh had just pissed off. He hated being the goddamn mediator. The kid had said that it was due to his role in his life, which he shouldn't even know, but he figured it out quickly. Most, not all of it. Hey, Kudo, Bakugou said loudly. Kudo glared at the boy, whose smile widened as he leaned back. Do not call me that, he warned. The kid laughed, waving a hand in dismissal. Get your big boy pants on and change the band. I don't need to get y'all confused right now. Kudo did change the band around his wrist, not because the kid said so. Do you know who it is? He asked, trying to assess the damage control. Principal, most likely, Bakugou said with a shrug. Better keep him from expelling Izuku. Kudo nodded, hating the fact that it seemed like he was taking orders from this child. I will. Don't worry, kid. He enunciated the last word, hoping the child would get the hint, but he was too busy making small explosions in his hand to really care. Bakugou, a voice said loudly, and he immediately shut his fist. What have I told you about unauthorized quirk use? The principal asked. He had spoken to the man a few times, and it didn't get much better. Bakugou huffed, but didn't apologize, standing up. Let's get this bullshit over with, he muttered, looking down at Kudo. He followed, taking a catch step to prevent himself from falling. I assume it is not Izuku, is it? The principal asked, the question directed at Bakugou instead of Kudo. No, Kudo said simply, trying to make eye contact with the larger man. He had no status or physique to actually appear intimidating. I am second. The man groaned, rubbing at his eyes. Really? Again? He mumbled under his breath before stepping aside. Into the office. Let's go. Kudo took the lead, despite Bakugou wanting to, holding open the door for the others. The other boys started it, Bakugou said, before Kudo could stop him. The boy always managed to piss off those in charge. The principal shot him a glare as the door shut behind them and they could actually take in the familiar room. The man sitting at the desk was the most unfamiliar thing, though Kudo had watched 8's perspective long enough to know the man. Tsukuyuchi, he said, before he could think about it, a little louder than a whisper. The detective raised an eyebrow as Bakugou shot him a confused look. What was that? Tsukuyuchi asked, leaning forward. Kudo shook his head quickly, bowing slightly. I didn't say anything. He tried to quickly correct himself, hoping the man hadn't heard. Luckily, he nodded, leaning back again as Bakugou grabbed Kudo's arm and dragged them to the chairs. The fuck was that? He asked, but Kudo just shook his head. Of all the goddamn people to want to speak to the kid, of course it would be his father's friend, the one who actually knew about their existence. Kinda. Kudo didn't remember exactly what the man knew, but he wasn't going to give anything up. He had to keep control in this exchange, to keep the kid and all of them safe. Sit, kids, the principal said, sitting in his own chair. This is a detective from the nearby precinct. Would you mind introducing yourself? He directed the question at Tsukuyuchi. Of course, the detective said. My name is Detective Tsukuyuchi from the Musatafu Police Precinct. He smiled at Bakugou and Kudo kindly, holding a hand out. Kudo took it first, ignoring the look Bakugou was giving him. That is quite a grip there, he said with a smile. Kudo didn't bother saying anything back, letting go of the man's hand. What do you want, old man? Bakugou asked. Bakugou, the principal chided. Tsukuyuchi held a hand up, laughing slightly. It's all right. It can't be all that exciting to have to stay at school even longer. The principal nodded, and Tsukuyuchi seemed to think over something. Actually, would you mind getting me a cup of coffee? He asked the principal. The principal frowned, shaking his head slightly. I cannot leave 2 minors alone with you, he argued. He was definitely better than the old principal, who wouldn't have cared at all. It is official business, Tsukuyuchi said, sliding something over. I assumed it would be more comfortable for Izuku to speak to me at school rather than the station. The principal's face contorted as he looked between Kudo and Bakugou. All right, he said, finally getting up. I will let you know that you are being monitored, and I will not be shutting the door, he clarified. Tsukuyoshi nodded, waiting until the man left before looking over at Kudo. Like actually looking at him, head to toe. He really wished it was the kid sitting here and not him, but he couldn't initiate a switch. Only Izuku could. Hello, Izuku, the man said. I know you may not know me, but I actually knew your father. Kudo nodded quietly, trying to think of how to respond. Had he ever visited Izuku and his mom before they had been switched? Should Izuku know him? Or him in this case? It's not Izuku, Bakugou cut in before he could figure it out. Oh, the detective said, his eyebrows twisting in confusion. Bakugou is correct, Kudo finally spoke, taking a deep breath. My name is Second. I am an alter of Izuku's. He used the lie, watching the detective closely as something seemed to pass over his face. It was gone just as quickly, his easy smile holding there. Well then, he said, holding a hand out. It's a pleasure to meet you, Second. Kudo didn't take it, and he eventually put it back in his lap, nodding. I assume I cannot speak to Izuku, then. What do you want, old man? Bakugou asked again. We don't have all fucking day. The detective nodded, looking over at Bakugou quickly. And who might you be? He asked softly. There was no malice in his voice, no hidden objective. Instead, it just seemed to be curiosity, which made him all the more dangerous. Katsuki Bakugou, he said loudly, puffing up his chest. Izuku's friend and someone who wants to know what the fuck you want. Tsukuyoshi nodded, pulling some papers from a bag. A few different reasons. One is to simply check on Izuku. I know your father's passing must have been hard for you. He seemed to hesitate after, waiting for a response. Kudo hesitantly touched Bakugou's hand, unsure of where he was supposed to lead this. This man was way too close to everything. And ate. Fuck's your quirk, bastard. Tsukuyoshi looked away from Kudo and back to Bakugou. Now that's an odd question. Why would you ask that? He asked calmly. Bakugou huffed, shaking his head. Because that would have been Zuku's first question, and I'll ask it in his absence. There was a pause as Bakugou readjusted to be closer to the man. And, as an officer of the law in an unofficial setting, you must disclose it to me now that I asked, since you are interviewing us. Tsukuyoshi blinked in surprise, laughing slightly as he nodded. You are correct. You are very smart, Bakugou. No, Bakugou corrected. I'm just not an idiot. Now what's your quirk, old man? Tsukuyoshi nodded, adjusting the files he held. Lie detector. I know when someone is lying to me. He looked back over at Kudo for a second before looking down at the files. Now, I suppose we should get into the official stuff. Do you both have library IDs? Shit. Kudo took a deep breath, trying to rack his brain. The kid was good with quirks. He really was not the best. Quirks were not as common in his time, but there had to be a loophole. No, he finally said, letting himself relax back into the chair and don a simple smile. Maybe it was body language. Yeah, we do, shit-ass, Bakugou said, nudging him. Kudo shook his head, glaring at the loudmouthed boy. We had temporary passes. They expired already, he pointed out. Luckily, Bakugou seemed to understand he was taking over, leaning back into the chair. I see, the detective said, nodding. I ask because there's a recent blog post that started from the library that is a matter of security. He didn't expand on it, looking comfortable. Would you happen to have any ideas on that? Kudo nodded, smiling back. It's very popular. There are a lot of people who use those computers. The man's face remained in a simple smile, so Kudo suspected he had said the right thing. And you didn't by any chance see who wrote it? He asked directly. No, Kudo said, glaring at the man. I wasn't fronting during that time. It wasn't a lie. Izuku had been. Tsukuyoshi nodded, sliding a file over to Kudo. He took it, not opening it up as he waited for an explanation. I took the liberty of getting security footage. You wouldn't happen to think any of these people look familiar. We traced the origin back to that computer. Kudo cursed in his head, looking down at the pictures. One was obviously Izuku's green hair, besides Bakugou's blonde. Fuck you accusing us of? Bakugou asked, snatching the photo. How did you come by that information? Tsukuyoshi asked, leaning forward again. All off record, of course. Bakugou looked to Kudo, whose mind raced as he tried to think of a lie. Tell the truth and they would risk Izuku and all his family's lives. He was just a middle schooler. I don't know what... He started before his voice cut out. He could feel it happen, the way his head suddenly got heavier and his eyes hurt to keep open. His hands started tingling as he looked over to Bakugou. The boy nodded quickly, saying something he couldn't hear as he reached forward and took Kudo's shoulders. He couldn't feel the boy's hands on his shirt, though, his mind growing more distant. Izuku had never initiated a switch this violent. Izuku sat up, shaking his head as he tried to think properly. He hadn't fully meant to switch out. He was enjoying writing in his notebook about the man's quirk and all that it meant, but there was an uneasiness between everyone. They all cast him strange looks and kept shifting in a way that wasn't right for pro-heroes. Which he knew they were. Kacchan didn't believe him, and he didn't try to force his friend to, but somehow he had pro-heroes living in his mind. They didn't like the detective. "Zuku?" Kacchan asked, his hands tightening from where they rested on his shoulders. He nodded, still trying to get used to the feeling of his mouth and body, trying to let it sink in. "Are you all right, Izuku?" the detective asked, kneeling directly in front of him. He jumped back, a startled yelp coming from his throat as the chair fell backward and he hit his head. "Back the fuck up," Kacchan yelled, standing over Izuku as he held a hand out. "Come on, let's get you back up." He didn't comment on the weird switch, something that had never occurred while he was speaking. He didn't even know he could do that. "Thanks, Kacchan," he mumbled, licking his 2 dry lips. "Sorry," he said when he was back on his feet, bowing to the detective. The detective seemed nervous, nodding as he sat back in his seat, his leg bouncing slightly. "I didn't mean to startle you." He reached a hand out for Izuku, but he didn't take it, looking at it. "Can we go?" Kacchan asked, holding Izuku's arm. The detective shook his head, putting his hand back in his lap. "I still need to know how you guys came by this information. It's a security threat." "And some children figured it out?" Bakugou asked with a laugh. "Even if we fucking did, it clearly wasn't all that well protected." Izuku stepped forward, touching Kacchan's hand. "My father. You knew him?" Izuku asked before letting go of Kacchan to fix the chair. His head still pounded, but he had questions. Questions he didn't care about as a kid, and he wouldn't burden his mom with. The detective nodded slowly, sighing. I did. He stumbled over his words slightly. "He was a good man." Izuku's eyebrows narrowed as he watched the man. "He was gone for weeks on end," Izuku pointed out. "Yes," while the detective hesitated, leaning forward. "His job kept him busy." Izuku raised an eyebrow. "He was an accountant," he tried. It was brief, but the detective shut his eyes for a bit longer, his eyebrows drawing down slightly more. "Yes, he was," the detective said with a nod. Izuku laughed slightly, shaking his head. "No, he wasn't," he said with a shrug. "I just wanted to see how you would combat a lie." Kacchan looked at him confused, but Izuku ignored it. "So why was he gone all the time, since you knew him so well?" The detective laughed slightly, shaking his head. "Nice try, but you can't turn this back on me." He gestured to the file of photos, sighing. "How did you know that information?" "Wasn't us," Izuku said with a shrug. Kacchan went to speak, but Izuku looked at him with a sly grin that he matched perfectly. The detective laughed slightly, shaking his head. "Your stature and hair is distinctive," he pointed out. Izuku nodded, handing the files back. "Yeah, it is, and I'm sure your quirk just activated, but it wasn't us. You're conducting an investigation, less than officially, in a school with 2 minors who don't have any parent or guardian present," Izuku said with a smile. "And writing a blog is not illegal. So unless you would like to legally arrest us with more evidence than your quirk, which can be easily flawed, then it wasn't us." He shrugged slightly as Kacchan elbowed him with a chuckle. The detective's eyebrows nodded as he frowned, clutching the papers tightly. "You two are very educated on laws." "Izuku is fucking quirkless," Kacchan pointed out, "not to mention my own destructive quirk and the fact he's mentally ill." He looked over to Izuku, who scowled before adding, "No offense." "Offense taken," Izuku said before giggling, "but the point still stands. The law is something we have dealt with a lot since elementary school, and he won't intimidate us into telling you anything we don't want to." The detective hesitated, looking down at the files before something slammed on the desk. "I believe you've spoken to my students long enough, detective," the principal said with a tight smile. "I would like to ask you to leave the premises now." The detective nodded, standing up slowly. "Of course." He reached a hand out to Izuku, who shook it quickly before doing the same to Kacchan. "It was very enlightening to speak to you two." He nodded before leaving the room, leaving them alone. The principal rubbed his eyes, sitting down slowly. "Now how the heck did you get a black eye second?" he asked, looking up at Izuku. Izuku laughed hesitantly, all his confidence gone. "Izuku, actually." The principal groaned, resting his head on the table as he muttered under his breath. "Your kid is fucking terrifying," Nayo-sama muttered, setting the files down. Toshinori laughed slightly, nodding. he gets that from Inko, not me. Okay, wow. So, yeah, this is the one that people were like, oh, this isn't accurate, or this isn't how this would go, and blah, 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 blah. Which, okay, I don't mean to, like, say blah, 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 as if, I'm hating on them, or whatever. I'm just generally, it's came up in my mind and everything that, you know, if this is such high security, how did they get the information and everything? Like I tried to explain in the last one, it just kind of happens, you know? That's the excuse I'll use for it. Really, the answer is I don't care to do the research on it or figure out the actual reasoning. But I guess I'll just say it just kind of happens, you know, when you're stuck with people in your head for so many years. There's a comment that really made me laugh on this one chapter that's like, no, he definitely gets the haunted ass quirk from you. Like, yeah, okay, that's fair. He does get that from him. Let's see. Yes, they all know who Tsukuyuchi is, despite the fact that they don't always, like, see the vision of their user. They still know basics, especially since Tsukuyuchi knew Nana as well, so that's 2 of their holders who knew the same man, so. And, you know, the same thing will probably come up with other people who knew both holders. It's just, you know, how it works. Honestly, I don't know anything about the law on this one, so don't take anything I said for real, especially since, you know, this is quirks and they're not even real. Don't be talking to any officials like this. That is how you get in trouble. And if, I'm not gonna say that one. Oh, the switch that Izuku did. Yeah, so only he can switch them out, but this one wasn't quite purposeful. So he can switch them out if he really thinks about it, or in moments of, like, high tense or stress. Like in this one, the others were all under a lot of stress because they were speaking to Tsukuyuchi, and Izuku, I think, could subconsciously feel that, so he shifted out of the vestige plane to get away from them. Honestly, this was more just Katsuki and Izuku having a good friendship, and the fact that Katsuki is actually the more reasonable of them, because he's had to deal with this crap, which I absolutely love. Responsible Bakugou. It's just fun. Anyways, the next chapter is called Flying Cockroaches Can Burn. That is a statement I stand by. Cockroaches, awful. Flying cockroaches, horrible. Anyways, thank you guys so much for listening, and I hope you will join me in the next one.